you were kind of the primary suspect in this homicide
I still
investigation. You still are. What are your thoughts about that, and what are your emotions right now? What's kind of going through your head?
This is Robert Leeming, and at the time of this recording, his ex-girlfriend and her 22-month-old daughter had been missing for 11 days. And in the weeks to follow, Robert's story would become turbulent and grisly. But is Robert Leeming an innocent man? Or was he hiding a terrible and dark secret to the rest of the world? My name is Adrian, and welcome back to another video by Coffeehouse Crime. Today we're looking at the case of Robert Leeming and the solved disappearance of Jasmine Lovett and her daughter, Elias Anderson. But before we get into today's video, I just wanted to let you know that I post solved, unsolved and strange cases here on a weekly basis. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing to Coffeehouse Crime. So pull up a seat, grab a coffee and sit back. This is the case of Robert Leeming. The coniferous spruce, maple syrup, and snow. Of course, I'm talking about Canada. And our case today takes us to the western half, to the city of Calgary. Nestled to the east of Canada's mountainous Banff National Park, Calgary is somewhat isolated from its neighbours. But that is not necessarily a bad thing. Millions of people travel here for its beautiful landscapes, resort towns, and very comfortable way of living. And deep in the southern suburbs of Calgary lived Jasmine Lovett and her daughter, Elias Anderson. Jasmine was renting, paying monthly to live with their landlord, Robert Leeming. And although this rental agreement was strictly business, the relationship between Jasmine and Robert was not. Following the birth of Elias, Jasmine had recently split up with Elias' father. And, as you can imagine, being a young single mother put Jasmine in a vulnerable position. At the age of 24, she was left to face the struggles of everyday life by herself. To Jasmine, her baby daughter Elias was her world. But there was much more to Jasmine outside of being a mother. She still had needs, desires, and the want to be loved. And so, after breaking up with Elias' father, she took to dating apps to find a new partner. It's on one of these apps that she encountered a new face, and his name was Robert Leeming. The two of them started talking, and over time, they grew closer, this eventually leading into a casual relationship. Only 1 month into dating, Jasmine had found herself in a difficult housing situation, which in return prompted Robert to offer her to come stay with him, on the condition if she could afford a small amount of rent. Moving forward, their home life was simple, and Robert was happy to help look after Elias whenever Jasmine needed to work or run errands. And in return, Jasmine would offer comfort and support when it came to Robert's own son, who lived with his ex-girlfriend. Jasmine was grateful to have Robert. Supposedly, he was a very supportive partner. And this happy way of living would continue, but only for a short while. Because Robert Leeming actually had a dark history. Being the child to a British military officer, Robert was born in a home away from home, on a British army base located in Germany. But soon after this, his parents moved back to England, where Robert spent most of his childhood in the small town of Marlborough, located in Wiltshire, England. His life was standard and rural, growing up in the countryside next to his brothers Christopher and George Leeming. However, at the age of 7, strange fascinations began to emerge. Barely old enough to even know what one was, Robert started to collect knives. Maybe something to expect from an edgy teenager, but not a 7-year-old child. And surprisingly, his parents allowed Robert to keep these knives too. Gearing up towards adulthood, Robert decided not to go to university, but instead, he trained up to become a heavy machinery mechanic. It was in the late 2000s, while on the internet, that Robert started speaking to a young teacher in Canada, and her name was Sarah. The two would speak almost every night, adjusting their sleep schedules so they could tackle the time zone difference. And before they knew it, they fell in love. However, there was one thing that was preventing their relationship from progressing any further, and that was the Atlantic Ocean. They say that distance makes the heart grow fond. And granted, it certainly can. But indefinitely living far away from your partner isn't easy. At the time, Sarah was training to become a teacher, and she didn't exactly want to give up her professional studies for a man that she'd never properly lived with before. So Robert decided to apply for Canadian residency instead. And fortunately, with Canada being the size that it is, the country heavily relies on its trucks to support its economic demands, and therefore heavy machinery mechanics were in very high demand. So after being granted permanent residency, Robert uprooted himself from his quaint rural town of Marlborough and moved over to the mountainous countryside of Canada. Sarah lived in Calgary to be precise, and shortly after arriving, the two got married in the month of February 2013. Before buying their first place together in the suburb of Cranston. They bought slightly above their comfortability, purchasing a brand new townhouse in the new estate of Cranston's Cranfield, which was a perfect place to begin a family. Which is exactly what happened, as soon after they had a son, with their pet dog Axel making a fourth addition to the family. A relationship once torn apart by an ocean would finally flourish over the years into a family. Perfect love story, right? You would be forgiven for thinking so, but unfortunately, they would divorce in the year 2017, and the reasons for this divorce were very understandable. The dark life of Robert Leeming runs deep. In official divorce papers signed by Sarah, Robert had been emotionally abusing her throughout the years. Within these documents, Sarah claimed, "He told me I was crazy, told me I was nuts, called me useless and worthless, and told me I needed psychiatric help." Sarah also claimed that Robert told her that she had ruined his life by having a baby he didn't want, a dog he didn't care for, and giving him a life that he didn't desire to continue. He saw every shortcoming and drawback in his life to be Sarah's fault. Problems started appearing outside of his marriage too. Robert often jumped between jobs, under the reason that he was often accused of stealing from his employer. And he often partook in drug use too. Towards the end of his marriage with Sarah, he was drinking and smoking marijuana on a daily basis. Which sure may be no problem, but everything in moderation, right? He was also charged with 3 counts of animal cruelty. His most shameful moment was when he took the family dog Axel out to the mountains, where he then left him tied to a tree, with no food or water, to die. All of this behaviour accumulated over the years, eventually leaving Sarah to feel like she and her son were in danger. Robert was still collecting knives too, and at this point he had over 60 of them. He was also collecting pistols, of which he stored in a vault. The divorce went ahead and the two formally split, which actually resulted in a strict no-contact policy. And as for the 4-year-old son, well, no surprise, he went to Sarah. And, due to previous negligence, Robert could only see his son under very strict supervision. But with Sarah now safe and out of the picture, Robert was growing lonely. That's when he decided to take to dating apps, which of course is where he met Jasmine. As time progressed and after Jasmine moved in, Robert would once again start to feel tied down by Jasmine and her daughter. This feeling made Robert very unhappy, and through desperation, he re-downloaded several old dating apps. But Jasmine was smart. She knew something was up, and she noticed that Robert started to act different when around her. She even expressed her concern to her sister Genevieve, who had always thought that Jasmine's and Robert's relationship was a little unusual. Eventually, Jasmine confronted Robert to accuse him of cheating on her. He denied it, but deep down, she knew what was going on. Unfortunately, these circumstances would lay the foundation to a very rocky relationship. But despite this, they would outwardly portray themselves as still together, even while at gatherings with Jasmine's family. This included a family gathering on the 14th of April 2019, when Robert and Jasmine attended a dinner with Jasmine's mother Kim and sister Genevieve. The meal went as planned. There was nothing out of the ordinary between the two, and the day was mostly spent playing with Aaliyah and enjoying the early spring weather. However, little did Jasmine's family know that this would be the last time they would ever see Jasmine or Aaliyah again. On the 19th of April 2019, Jasmine's family had arranged to have dinner together. Jasmine accepted the offer. With Kim making all preparations, all Jasmine and Genevieve had to do was turn up. But Jasmine failed to make it. And when they tried to call her, her phone would ring, but eventually go through to voicemail. When it came to Jasmine, this was very unusual. She was very attentive and informative towards her family, regularly keeping in touch through her phone and in person. In fact, she had always kept in very regular contact with her mother and her sister. Even just a couple days of silence was strange. Nevertheless, her family thought that maybe she had just let time get away with her, so no further correspondence was made. But as 2 more days passed and still no word from Jasmine, Kim started to get worried. She then decided to travel to Robert's townhouse to check in on the family. Nothing seemed amiss upon walking to the front door. Aaliyah's toys were scattered in the front, and there were 2 pairs of sneakers on the front porch. But she did notice that the sneakers were wet, as if they had just been hosed down. But after knocking on the front door, no one answered. She tried again, but still, nothing. Kim walked away, unsure of what to do. But as 2 days of silence turned into 5, her worries had finally come to a breaking point. Kim travelled down to a local police station to report her daughter, Jasmine Lovett, and her granddaughter, Aaliyah Sanderson, as missing. Police were quick to launch an investigation into their disappearance, and the search would begin at their last known place of residence, which of course was Robert's townhouse. Police officers arrived at Robert's residence the very next day, but just the same as Kim's visit, they would knock on the door only to be met with silence. With no answer, they assumed that maybe he just wasn't home, so after leaving a notice on his front door, they returned to their car, waiting until he got back. He never showed up, but as it got dark outside, officers in their car would notice that the lights inside the house were turning on and off. So with newfound curiosity, police again approached the house, but this time knocked harder and shouted for his name, knowing that he was inside. And eventually, Robert caved. He opened the door and let officers inside. And quite clearly, Robert was very drunk and high.
How's it going?
Says she's with her sister.
Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Alright, well, we're just gonna take a quick look around. We need to have a look.
So, sorry, you're Robert?
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, but we've been here for hours and hours and hours now, hey? Banging on your door and...
Ringing on the doorbell.
Calling your phone.
Again. I've been drinking and smoking a lot, so
Okay.
fucked up.
Okay, so she's not with her sister.
What do you mean?
Well, that's the reason that we're here,
Why do you think we're here?
is that the family's calling us, saying we haven't heard from our daughter and our sister.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay, that makes sense?
Yeah,
Okay, why does that make sense?
because I haven't heard from her either.
Okay. So, do you guys get in some sort of argument?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Well, not that you're aware of. Like, you're not making a whole lot of sense to me here, guy.
like, I don't know what. Sorry, I'm still getting my bearings here. So she's not with her family, but she did threaten to move out. I don't know, like 3 weeks ago. We got into a tizzy. She threw a bunch of my stuff out, food, stuff like that. Nothing like that would concern me.
Nothing that would concern you. Okay.
I've had people living with me before, and they move out. You don't hear.
Right, but this isn't just like a roommate. This is your girlfriend.
No, it's more roommate than girlfriend.
Okay. So, the last time that you saw Jasmine was when?
Thursday.
And at that time, you guys were A-okay or fighting, or what was the status?
I would say in the air, judging by what obviously has gone down. Just, a lot of drinking a lot over the weekend, because I've probably been on my own, right?
Okay.
Does she have a car?
I don't know, she doesn't have a license as far as
Right.
I'm aware.
That's from home. Did you see the note on the door?
I do now.
Okay. I'm gonna go make a call to mom and try and get some more info.
Obvious to say, but officers were not satisfied with Robert's story, or even his behaviour to be honest. But before officers could do anything about it, they would have to go and obtain a search warrant for his house. And only one day after speaking to Robert, police would finally obtain that warrant. In the early afternoon hours of the 25th of April, a SWAT team arrived at Robert Leeming's house to arrest him. And shortly after arrival, things would turn strange very quickly. To begin with, entering through the front door proved to be almost impossible, and after attempting to open it with force, the door held firm. Once they had gained access through the back door, police internally made their way to open the front door, only to be greeted with this sight. Before being arrested, Robert had barricaded his front door shut with barge poles, and proceeding with their search, investigators found several strips of bacon placed around the house. One dangling from the back of a dining chair, and another strip located in the cap of a dry sump system in the furnace room. They would also find a locked padlock on the door to the master bedroom, where Robert kept his guns and his extensive knife collection. But none of these strange clues proved any sort of foul play. While under arrest, Robert claimed that he last saw Jasmine and Aaliyah on the 18th of April, when the three of them had gone for a picnic near Bragg Creek. He claimed,
"We went for beers and chilled out and came back, and they were here for the next day. I went somewhere else, and they weren't here when I came back."
Robert also denied being in a relationship with Jasmine, and told authorities that there was no way he could do anything to a young mother or her daughter, and apparently, he was out at the time Jasmine had left the property. Although peculiar, this investigation found no substantial evidence that linked Robert Leeming to the disappearance of Jasmine or Aaliyah, and with no evidence, they were forced to release Robert only 24 hours later. He was therefore released and dropped off at a local shopping mall, where he was then told to sit tight while forensic analysis wrapped up. And, being British, he went straight to the pub for drinks. After a few pints, the media showed up, where they then asked if they could interview him, and being drunk, he agreed. And, you know, that probably wasn't a good idea to begin with, especially with the way that he answered some of those questions.
Okay, ready to go?
Okay. I mean, it's been a whirlwind couple of days, big investigation. What can you tell us about your experience with this in the last 2 days?
Yeah, I can. I was arrested by the tactical team. It's pretty extreme from my experience. Of course, I'd never experienced this before, and they're still investigating.
So, how long were you in police custody?
24 hours, I think.
So, what have you been doing in the meantime?
Just been here. Literally.
So, was she living there at the time?
Correct.
Okay, so you own the house.
Correct.
She
Is a tenant.
along
Right.
with Aaliyah.
With her daughter, yes, correct.
Okay, so that was the extent of your relationship. She rented from you,
Correct.
and you shared the home.
Correct.
Was there any romantic involvement between the two of you, or is there?
There was initially, but towards the end, no.
How would you characterize your relationship with Jasmine?
Good.
I mean, were you a boyfriend, girlfriend, or?
No, just good friends. Nothing alarmed me until, of course, I got arrested. So.
What happens with you right now?
I'm just gonna wait until I get a phone call to say that I can go home.
How are you feeling throughout all of this?
Traumatized, of course.
Is there anything else that you want to add to all this?
Yeah, if anyone sees her or Aaliyah, Jasmine or Aaliyah, please, let the authorities know. They said that they would be done with the property today, and that I would be able to go back to the property. But
So you're hoping to sleep there tonight?
I hope to sleep somewhere tonight. Yes.
During this interview, there were many troubling signs to indicate that Robert knew more than he was actually leading on, and his choice in words often depicted a much more worrying conclusion to the case. For example, it was noted that the way he described Jasmine was in the past tense.
I don't
Where do
know
you think they are?
I have no idea.
Did she hang out with questionable people? Was she a good person?
No, she was a good person. Nice person. Yeah, I can't. There was nothing negative that I would say about her at all. She was a lovely person. I had no issues with her.
Robert's body language often mismatched his words too, and he always seemed to look away when answering serious questions.
Robert, I'm just curious, you've been very open with the media here today. Why is it that you're choosing to speak to the media?
Because I have nothing to hide.
You were kind of the primary suspect in this homicide
I still am.
investigation. You still are. What are your thoughts about that, and what are your emotions right now? What's kind of going through your head?
It's very stressful, but I hope they will be found, and I hope we can move forward from this. We were friends, absolutely friends, and supported each other.
He would also say correct way too many times. Kind of annoying.
Correct.
Following an inconclusive investigation, Robert was eventually allowed back in his home later that evening. Forensic analysis had found nothing, but Calgary police were still determined to find answers. However, even after sweeping through the surrounding wilderness, nothing pivotal was found. Digging through local surveillance footage would confirm one final sighting of Jasmine and Aaliyah, which was on the 15th of April at a shop just a few miles from where they lived. But otherwise, that was it. Robert maintained his innocence wherever he could, claiming that he was with another woman at the time of their disappearance. But throughout the remainder of April, Robert's health and his behaviour continued to decline. In the eyes of Calgary's police department, Robert was still their prime suspect, but they still needed to unearth a connection between him and Jasmine's absence. Psychologists analysed his public interviews, and through his body language, they believed he had acted in a dishonest manner. So, following a rather dry investigation, the Calgary Police Department decided to bring this case up a notch. Child Protective Services began to plan an undercover operation against Robert, a project that they named Operation Highwood. The goal was simple. Undercover cops would pose as cop-hating informants to Robert, win his trust, and then learn if he had anything to do with Jasmine and Aaliyah's disappearance. But what they ended up uncovering would be far more sinister and absolute. In May of 2019, two undercover officers approached Robert as he walked out of a liquor store near his home. They approached him under the fake disguise of being locals who lived in the neighbourhood and had seen his media interview. They expressed their concerns towards Robert, informing him that they knew someone who had discovered a bag of evidence that incriminated Robert with Jasmine's disappearance. And, surprisingly, Robert took the bait. Leading the undercover officers to his workplace, he knew it was a location where he wasn't being monitored. And while there, he talked to his supposed new friends for several hours. The topic and all details were all about what really happened to Jasmine and Aaliyah. And tragically, they were both dead. He had killed Jasmine and buried both of their bodies. After 4.5 hours, Robert agreed to take his new best buddies to their location, driving 90 miles west of Calgary to Grizzly Creek in Kananaskis County. Exiting his car, Robert led the two men between several trees, where he then quickly came to a stop.
Okay, so where to?
Asked one of the men, to which Robert replied with,
You're looking at it.
and beside their feet, underneath the crisp mulch and dead branches, lay a blue blanket. They were looking at the shallow grave of Jasmine and Aaliyah. Jasmine appeared to have been struck in the head, with a bullet wound behind her left ear, and as for little Aaliyah, she had trauma injuries to her head. An overwhelming stench of gasoline hung in the air. With their bodies finally located, officers would reveal Robert's one big mistake, and with that said, they would formally arrest him for the murder of Jasmine Lovett and Aaliyah Sanderson. And with Robert's secret now finally out in the open, details of what actually happened to Aaliyah and Jasmine would eventually come to light. On the 16th of April 2019, Jasmine and Aaliyah were spotted at their local supermarket before heading back to Robert's home. And later that evening, Robert was looking after Aaliyah while Jasmine was out of the house. Robert claims that, allegedly, Aaliyah fell down the flight of stairs in their front room, and apparently, Robert did not realise the extent of her injuries. So instead of calling emergency services, he put her to bed. Jasmine returned home later that night, and after going upstairs to check on her daughter, she found that Aaliyah was dead. Jasmine was overcome with feelings of terror, pain, and confusion, and there was only one person to blame. Distraught with the situation, Jasmine confronted Robert, where the two then found themselves in a heated argument, until eventually Robert lost his temper. He picked up a hammer from the kitchen counter, and when she wasn't looking, he struck Jasmine in the back of the head. She fell to the floor, bleeding but still alive. Seething from the argument but still full of rage, Robert wasn't done. He ran upstairs, unlocked the master bedroom door, and picked up one of his guns. Descending back downstairs, he found Jasmine lying on the floor. He aimed at her head and pulled the trigger. Robert then wrapped the two bodies in a blue moving sheet and cleaned the crime scene to cover his tracks. The next day, on the 17th of April, Robert was then spotted filling up his car and an extra jerry can of gasoline. And several hours later at 6 PM, supposedly after dumping the bodies, he was then seen at a cannabis retail store. And the very next day, he was then spotted throwing garbage into the dumpsters of his condo complex. Some of these items, which were vital to the trial, were later discovered by investigators. Robert was again found on CCTV, taking his car through a car wash in further efforts to cover his tracks. The legal proceedings to this case are quite messy and choppy, but 2 years later, in November of 2021, Robert pled guilty to the murder of Jasmine Lovett. He would, however, plead not guilty to murdering Aaliyah Sanderson, claiming that her death was completely accidental. Robert still argues to this date that she accidentally fell down the stairs, and while forensic analysis claims that this could potentially be true, the evidence suggests that it's very unlikely. And with the number of times that Robert has lied to people, including the police, the media, and the public, do we really believe him now? With Robert pleading guilty to Jasmine Lovett, but not guilty to Aaliyah Sanderson, the judge will make up their own mind on the 24th of January 2022. And with Canadian second-degree murder charges carrying life sentences, Robert will only be eligible for parole sometime between 10 to 25 years, of which these figures can double if he is also found guilty of Aaliyah's death. And if you would like full case closure, I post case updates to my Instagram. I'll leave a link to that in the video description down below. With Robert Leeming's case at times being eerily similar to the case of Chris Watts, some have dubbed him as Canada's Chris Watts. And honestly, I can see why. Both Robert and Chris were bumbling through life, giving little care to those closest. They callously killed the people who loved them the most, cleaning the crime scene as if it meant nothing, and hiding their bodies in the most of remote areas. They lied to the media, lied to police, and even lied to themselves. But the cracks in their stories were obvious from the very beginning, and when their own story came crashing down upon them, they were caught. To finish off today's case, I thought I'd read out a statement that was written by Jasmine about life back in the year 2017. In a Facebook post to friends, she wrote, "If I could speak to everyone in the world at the same time, I would say slow down and enjoy what you've accomplished at this point so far. Find your inner peace and stay humble instead of always thinking too much about what you don't have or where you want to be in life but aren't yet. And remember, everyone's on their own amazing journey. Embrace who you are, be loud and proud, and remain positive. You're doing awesome." Thank you so much for watching another video today by Coffeehouse Crime. If you found this video interesting and would like to see more, then please remember to like the video and subscribe if you haven't yet. What are your thoughts about Robert Leeming? And do you think he'll be found guilty over Aaliyah Sanderson's death? Please share your thoughts in the comments down below. With today being this year's Blue Monday, make sure to give yourself some extra love. You deserve it. And with that said, I'll see you again next Monday. Look after each other. Goodbye.